Our featured guest tonight is a four-time Emmy Award winner whose iconic role as Olivia Walton in The Waltons made her a permanent part of TV history on a show that seemed to define a generation. Here to chat about her illustrious career, her current role as Catherine Dahmer on Netflix's blockbuster hit Monster, The Jeffrey Dahmer Story, and what she has coming up next is none other than actress Michael Learned. Michael, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
It's such an honor to have you here because an entire generation of people adored you as essentially America's mom for so long. I'm curious about your backstory, though, because I don't know too much about it. Where did you grow up?
Well, I grew up in Connecticut, in the country, on a farm, a 21-acre, quote, gentleman's farm. In Wisconsin, they call it a hobby farm. I milked goats every morning before I went to school. And when I came home, at night before I fed the animals and milked 3 goats because I stole money from my dad. So I had to pay it back for candy, to buy candy. And a teacher busted me. She said, your daughter is spending an awful lot of money on candy. Maybe you ought to look into it. And so that was my punishment, was to do chores and pay the money back, which I did. And now I'm totally off track. But I grew up on a farm in Connecticut, and then we moved to Austria. And so I lived in the most beautiful little village in Austria, which was near Salzburg, and went to school, the local school, and learned German. And we spent 3.5 years there. And I went off to boarding school in England to learn how to dance and act.
Is that how the idea of acting or performing came into the picture for you? Or was your family creative in some other ways? Or did it come just specifically to you?
Well, my family was creative in that they supported the arts. My mother and father took me to the ballet and theater, and my grandmother as well. My grandfather was an artist. And so in that sense, my family, there was always music and always something wonderful happening in our house. And I wanted to be a dancer. I really wanted to be a dancer. And when we were living in Austria, I got very depressed as a kid. And the local doctor said she doesn't have any peers who are interested in the things that she's interested in, which was kind of true. So she suggested that I go off to boarding school and study dance. But I happened to win the drama cup, which was just for the school. And one of the teachers came up to me and said, Michael, you're not really a very good dancer. Why don't you think about being an actress instead? So that's how that happened.
So once you kind of went down that track, was your family supportive, or were they worried about your job prospects?
They were terribly supportive. They may have worried a little bit, but they didn't care about stuff like that. They were just, go for it. Whatever is your passion, go for it.
Now, if I'm not mistaken, you kind of took up theater before you took up screen acting. Did I get that right? And if so, what kind of drew you to theater initially, or was that just what was available?
Well, I had done television in Canada when I was married to my first husband, Peter Donat. But when I came to the States, I was nothing, and I kind of came in on Peter Donat's coattails at ACT. They wanted Peter, and so in order to make the offer a little more attractive, they took me as well. And I started off kind of understudying roles, and then I eventually became the leading lady at the American Conservatory Theater as well.
Do you think the theater prepared you for your role on the Waltons in any way? Because back then you were shooting in front of a live studio audience, right?
No, we did not shoot in front of an audience.
Oh, wow.
It was film. It was not television. It was shot on film and on location at times. We didn't have too many locations. We had a back lot, which is no longer, unfortunately. But, you could sit on that back lot and you would really believe you were in the middle of the country somewhere. Will Geer planted a real garden, and you'd sit on the porch. I'd see kids coming up the dirt road, visitors, visiting kids. And they'd see the house and they'd see the barn and the swing and everything, and their eyes would be like saucers, and then they'd open the front door and there'd be nothing on the other side, and their little faces would fall. I'm sure they're all in therapy over it, but.
So how did your being cast on the Waltons come about? I heard it's kind of a surreptitious story in many ways.
Well, how did it come about? A woman named Ethel Wynant, who was then the head of casting at CBS, used to come up to ACT where I was working, and she saw me in a number of plays. And so when the role of the Waltons came up, I thought I had short blonde hair and I was 32, and they were looking for a woman in her 40s with long red hair. So Fred Silverman, apparently, I heard him years later, did not think I was right for the part. And the story goes, she wrestled Fred Silverman to the ground over you. And thanks to Ethel Wynant, and I really do believe she fought for me, I got the part.
Because originally there was somebody else cast in the movie, and I think I've heard you mention this before, but Patricia Neal, I think, wanted the part for Olivia, right? And then, well,
I didn't know that. And Patricia and I became very good friends years later because she's the most gracious woman in the world. And I was sitting in Joe Allen's in New York, and this woman that I thought of as a huge movie star, Patricia Neal, came all the way over and said, "Congratulations, you're just lovely in the role, blah, blah, blah." And I said, "Well, thank God you didn't want it because I got it." And she said, "Oh, but I did, darling. They didn't want me." And I've never forgotten that because she was so gracious. I think I would have hid in a corner if some part that I'd really wanted had gone to somebody younger. I don't know. Hopefully I would be gracious too, but we became very close friends, very good friends. She was a lovely light.
Did you ever meet her husband? Because I can only imagine the conversations the three of you guys would have had.
No, I never met Raul. No.
It was just an interesting fellow. So you've been open about the fact that the time surrounding your casting in the Waltons was kind of one of the darker times of your life, but also kind of a time of spiritual awakening. What happened back then, and what has that spirituality meant to you in your life?
Well, a couple of things. I was going through a divorce from the father of my kids, who I actually loved very much. I just was going downhill myself, and as much as we loved each other, I felt I couldn't go on. I don't think at the time I really realized that a lot of it was that there were better ways I could have handled it rather than leaving and breaking up the family, which was a terribly traumatic and sad for me and for my kids, of course, and for Peter. I mean, he said, years later, he said, "I never thought you would leave me." So I was very much into the 1950s Stand By Your Man and all of that, but I couldn't do it. And I was drinking heavily at the time for me, and it wasn't working. Nothing was working. I just was terribly sad and depressed. And Ralph Waite at one point told me that he was getting sober, and he suggested that I consider it as well. And I was shocked. "What do you mean? I don't have a problem." And he said, "Well, just think about it." And so I did. And I haven't had a drink now in 45 years.
So the show was basically set during the Great Depression, World War II, even though it was being filmed like 30 some odd years later. You kind of lived through the tail end of that momentous time in our history. What do you remember about it? Or were there stories from your family that you were able to garner information from the polls?
Well, really, for me, it wasn't about the Depression. It was about being a mother during the Depression, where times were hard, and being an actress and married to an actor, we had hard times too. I mean, we.
If that's my wife, I just left.
It's an unknown name. Maybe it is.
Yeah, it's an old joke. That's such an old joke.
No, for me, it wasn't about, it was about really the character being a mom, being very religious and rather righteous, and at times not very likable, really. The more they did that, the happier I was, because I said, righteous people can be really very difficult and judgmental and not so great. So every now and then they would give me some kind of an attitude, which I liked, to play. Otherwise, it just would have been all sweetness and goo,